The coast of Maine is littered with jagged teeth, hidden shoals and black rocks that have swallowed countless vessels whole. To sail these waters without a beacon is to court death. That is why the Blackwood Point Lighthouse was constructed in 1887. For nearly 4 decades, it was manned by a single individual, Elias Vance. Elias wasn't just a keeper, he was a fanatic. He lived in absolute isolation, married only to the massive Fresnel lens at the top of the spiraling iron stairs. The villagers in the mainland town of Oakhaven rarely saw him. They only knew he was alive because, every evening without fail, a blinding beam of light would sweep across the churning Atlantic. Until the winter of 1923. It was the most brutal nor'easter the coast had seen in a century. Ice coated the cliffs as thick as armor. Telephone lines snapped, and the harbor froze solid. When the storm finally broke 3 days later, a supply boat fought its way out to Blackwood Point to check on Elias. They found the heavy oak door of the keeper's quarters blown completely off its hinges. The interior had been gutted by the freezing wind. Elias Vance was found at the very top of the tower, his frozen hand still rigidly gripping the brass turning crank of the lantern. He had died of exposure, refusing to leave his post while the storm raged. The Maritime Board quickly declared the lighthouse condemned. The tower was deemed structurally unsafe, the budget was reallocated to a newer station down the coast, and the heavy iron door was padlocked. Blackwood Point was left to rot in the salt and the sea. But the very next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a brilliant, piercing beam of light erupted from the abandoned tower. At first, the locals assumed a drifter or a stranded sailor had taken refuge in the structure. The Coast Guard dispatched a crew the following morning. They found the padlock untouched, fused shut by a fresh layer of sea ice. They broke the lock with a sledgehammer and climbed the spiraling stairs. The tower was completely empty. The oil reservoir for the lamp was bone dry. The heavy cotton wick was unburned. Yet, the massive glass lens was still warm to the touch. For the next 40 years, the Blackwood Point Lighthouse lit itself. Every single night, at the precise moment of dusk, the beam would miraculously ignite. It would sweep its rhythmic, perfect rotation across the black water, warning ships away from the rocks. Decades passed. World War II came and went. The world modernized, transitioning to automated, electric navigation systems. Yet out on that lonely rock, a lighthouse with no power grid, no oil, and no living keeper continued to function flawlessly. In 1951, a team of skeptical engineers from the mainland decided to put an end to the ghost stories once and for all. They arrived with heavy equipment, intent on dismantling the lantern mechanism entirely. They removed the Fresnel lens, piece by heavy piece. They dismantled the brass gears, detached the burner, and left the top of the tower completely bare, nothing but an empty glass room exposed to the howling elements. They returned to Oakhaven, smugly assuring the townspeople that the impossible phenomenon was over. That night, the town gathered on the docks, looking out toward the dark silhouette of the island. As dusk fell, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. From the empty, dismantled glass room of the tower, a blinding beam of light erupted. It didn't just shine, it rotated, sweeping the coast with the exact same timing as before. It was as if the light itself had a memory. Or, a ghost. But as the 1950s bled into the 1960s, the phenomenon took a deeply sinister turn. The fishermen who worked the graveyard shifts began to notice a terrifying change in the beam's behavior. It was no longer a steady, rhythmic warning. The rotation would suddenly halt. The beam would lock onto a specific, empty patch of the deep ocean. Then, it would begin to flash. Short bursts. Long bursts. It was a code, but not Morse. It was something older, something frantic. The empty lighthouse was communicating. On a freezing night in November 1963, exactly 40 years after Elias Vance froze to death, the harbormaster was watching the lighthouse through his binoculars. The beam was dead stopped, flashing its frantic, silent language into the void. Then, the harbor master dropped his binoculars in sheer terror. Because from the absolute, empty darkness of the deep ocean, 3 miles offshore where no ship, island, or buoy existed. Gemini Burkata. Something was flashing back. It was a pale, sickly green light, pulsing in rhythmic, deliberate bursts. The harbor master, a seasoned mariner named Arthur Pendleton, scrambled to retrieve his fallen binoculars off the wooden floorboards, his hands trembling so violently he could barely bring the heavy brass lenses to his eyes. When he finally focused on the horizon, the blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him cold and clammy in the drafty observation room. The green luminescence was not sitting on the surface of the water, it was diffusing upward from beneath the waves. And it was answering the lighthouse. Pendleton grabbed his leather-bound logbook and a stub of pencil, his eyes darting frantically between the stationary, blinding white beam of the abandoned lighthouse and the answering flashes rising from the abyss. He knew Morse code like the back of his hand, having served as a signalman in the Navy. The lighthouse, empty and locked tight for 4 decades, was repeating its desperate, frantic sequence over and over, WAIT, WAIT, WAIT. The emerald light from the ocean floor paused, letting the dark, churning water settle, before pulsing its slow, deliberate reply. FOUND, Pendleton stumbled back, overturning his wooden chair, and lunged for the shortwave radio. By dawn, the United States Coast Guard had been alerted to the bizarre phenomenon. Given the sheer absurdity of the report, they were initially dismissive, writing the whole thing off as the hysterical delusions of an aging harbor master staring for too long into the hypnotic sea mist. But when 3 separate local fishing trawlers came into port early, reporting erratic compass behavior, failing engines, and a strange, ambient glow radiating from the water at those exact coordinates, the Coast Guard finally relented. They dispatched the cutter USCGC Reliance to investigate the anomaly. The Reliance arrived on station late that evening, slipping through waters that felt uncharacteristically thick. The sky above was the color of bruised iron, and a heavy, unnatural calm had fallen over this specific patch of the Atlantic. The sea was completely flat, resembling a sheet of black obsidian, which only made the atmosphere aboard the ship more oppressive. From the bridge, Captain James Corwin observed the distant coast through the gathering gloom. Exactly as Pendleton had described in his panicked radio call, the beam from Elias Vance's lighthouse was not sweeping. It was locked in a dead stare, pinning the cutter in a blinding shaft of white light from 3 miles away. "Sonar, what are you seeing?" Corwin barked into the bridge comms, wiping a layer of cold condensation from the window. Below deck, the sonar operator was sweating profusely in the chilled, dimly lit room. "Nothing that makes any logical sense, Captain. The ocean floor drops off sharply here, about 200 fathoms down. But, there's a localized thermal spike. The water temperature around our hull has dropped 10 degrees in the last 5 minutes, but there's a massive heat signature directly below us. It's huge." "A rogue submarine?" Corwin asked, gripping the railing until his knuckles turned white. "No, sir. It's not moving with any mechanical propulsion. And it's not metal. The acoustic ping is scattering. It's like we're pinging off glass. Or bone." Suddenly, the ship's electrical grid flared. The radar screens flickered with violent static, and the compass needle on the binnacle spun wildly, whining like a dying insect before snapping clean off its pivot. A low, subsonic hum began to vibrate through the heavy steel deck of the Reliance, a frequency so deep and resonant it rattled the teeth in the crew's skulls and made their ears pop painfully. "Captain," the lookout shouted from the port side, pointing frantically into the dark water. Corwin rushed to the edge. Down in the ink-black depths, the green light was returning. It started as a pinpoint, a faint phosphorescent glow, but it was growing rapidly, expanding into a colossal, blinding halo of sickly jade. It was rising. Whatever was emitting the light was ascending from the 200-fathom drop, coming straight up toward the vulnerable belly of the cutter. Back on the shore, the lighthouse beam abruptly snapped off. The sudden darkness was jarring, a violent absence of the light that had burned unceasingly for 40 years. But the silence didn't last. The massive Fresnel lens inside the abandoned tower began to rotate again, but this time, the heavy, rusted gears shrieked. A grinding, metallic wail echoed across the water, loud enough to be heard over the rising wind. The light slammed back on, but the bulb was no longer burning a crisp, warning white. The lighthouse beam had turned a deep, bruised blood red, sweeping frantically back and forth across the water, as if searching. On the Reliance, the water began to boil. Thick, sulphurous bubbles erupted against the hull, sending clouds of foul-smelling steam billowing up over the deck. The ship violently pitched to starboard, groaning against an unseen, displaced force, and Corwin realized with cold horror that the water level wasn't just rising. The ocean was parting. A massive, smooth, bioluminescent surface breached the boiling waves just off the port bow, rising 10, then 20 feet into the freezing air, dripping with thick, black sludge. Gemini Burkata. Over the deck. The ship violently pitched to starboard, groaning against an unseen, displaced force, and Corwin realized with cold horror that the water level wasn't just rising. The ocean was parting. A massive, smooth, bioluminescent surface breached the boiling waves just off the port bow, rising 10, then 20 feet into the freezing air, dripping with thick, black sludge. It was not a whale. The shape was far too geometric, too perfectly curved to belong to any biological creature of the known world, yet it pulsed with a rhythmic, organic throbbing. Beneath the thick layer of viscous brine and centuries of ocean rot, a sickly, pale yellow light bled through the surface. It was the exact same hue as the impossible beam that had been sweeping from the abandoned lighthouse on the cliffs above. The stench that washed over the deck was suffocating, a sickening mixture of ozone, decaying kelp, and something metallic, like copper left to rust in a closed room. Hard to starboard. Get us away from that thing. Corwin roared, his voice cracking against the howling wind. But the helmsman, a seasoned sailor named Vance, was frozen, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring up at the monolith. Corwin lunged for the helm himself, fighting the violent tilt of the deck. As his hands gripped the damp wood of the wheel, a sound began to vibrate through the very timber of the ship. It was not a sound heard with the ears, but a low, resonant frequency that bypassed the eardrums and settled directly into the marrow of their bones. The glass of the binnacle vibrated so violently it shattered, spraying fine dust into the air. The compass needle was spinning in a frantic, unreadable blur. The ocean around them was no longer behaving like water. It was forming a swirling, hyperdense gravity well, trapping the ship in a localized vortex. No matter how hard Corwin wrenched the wheel, the rudder bit into nothing but churning foam. As the first structure continued to rise, dwarfing their mainmast, a second identical monolith breached the surface to the starboard side. Then a third, rising near the stern. The sea boiled away from them in roaring torrents. Through the freezing spray, Corwin saw that the thick, black sludge was finally sloughing off the objects, revealing a translucent, crystalline material underneath. Beneath the surface of these immense pillars, colossal, vein-like conduits pulsed with the yellow light, pumping some unknown energy upward toward the storm-choked sky. Desperate, Corwin snapped his gaze back toward the jagged silhouette of the island. The lighthouse, which had maintained a flawless, mechanized rotation for the last 40 years, suddenly stopped. Its relentless beam froze, cutting through the torrential rain, and locked directly onto the sea, onto the triangular formation of glowing monoliths that now surrounded Corwin's crippled vessel. The beam of the lighthouse flared, shifting from a warning beacon to a blinding, concentrated pillar of energy. The moment the light struck the water, the pulsing yellow veins inside the monoliths synced perfectly with it. They were communicating. Or worse, Corwin realized with a sickening drop in his stomach, they were feeding. The lighthouse wasn't warning ships away from the treacherous rocks. It was a tether. A subterranean anchor for something massive that had been sleeping beneath the sea, waiting to be summoned. The air pressure dropped so rapidly that several crew members collapsed to the deck, clutching their bleeding ears. Sparks showered from the ship's long-dead electrical rigging. The radio in the cabin, which had been silent for 2 days, suddenly shrieked to life with a blast of deafening, modulated static that sounded horrifyingly like a human voice screaming in reverse. The ocean beneath them gave way completely. With a sickening lurch, the entire ship was lifted out of the water, caught in a rising web of bioluminescent crystal that connected the 3 towering monoliths. The timber of the hull shrieked as it was suspended in mid-air, trapped in a glowing, geometric net. Slowly, the largest of the monoliths looming over the port bow began to rotate. A vertical fissure, hundreds of feet long, split the smooth surface of the crystal. As it opened, the yellow glow was eclipsed by a searing, impossible blue light, and a sound like grinding tectonic plates drowned out the storm. Deep within the fissure, an immense, singular iris contracted, focusing directly on the bridge where Corwin stood. Gemini Burkata. The iron door at the base of the tower was welded shut with decades of undisturbed red rust, the thick saltwater crust acting like a hardened mortar. It took 2 hours, a heavy sledgehammer, and a diamond-tipped saw to finally cut through the seal. When the heavy metal gave way, collapsing inward with a heavy, echoing clang, the expected rush of stale, dead air never came. Instead, the breath of the abandoned lighthouse was startlingly fresh, carrying the distinct, sharp scent of ozone, damp stone, and freshly polished brass. Inside, the spiral staircase stretched upward into the gloom, a spiraling spine of wrought iron that should have been brittle with structural decay. Yet, as the team's flashlights swept over the open grating of the steps, the beams revealed metal that was clean, oiled, and gleaming in the dark. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic, churning sound of the ocean beating against the exterior stones outside. As the investigators ascended the curving path, the ambient temperature inexplicably began to drop. With every 10 steps, the chill deepened until their breath plumed into thick white mist in the air, yet the curved brick walls felt strangely warm to the touch, vibrating with a faint, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to resonate deep within their bones. They reached the old keeper's quarters on the 3rd landing. The room was perfectly preserved, an immaculate time capsule from the night the facility was officially decommissioned and sealed in the winter of 1984. A half-finished game of solitaire sat spread across a small wooden table, the playing cards crisp, unbent, and free of yellowing. A ceramic mug sat beside it. When the lead researcher tentatively reached out, pulling off his heavy glove to touch the cup, he recoiled. The ceramic was still warm. But the true, horrifying impossibility awaited them higher up, at the very apex of the tower, in the lantern room itself. Climbing the final steep maintenance ladder, they emerged through the floor hatch into the glass-domed pinnacle. The massive Fresnel lens, a colossal, beautiful hive of cut glass prisms meant to magnify a simple central flame into a piercing, miles-long beam, dominated the cramped space. According to the government maritime archives, the halogen bulbs had been completely removed, the heavy diesel generators drained, and the backup batteries stripped when the island was left to the birds. The historical records were entirely accurate. There was absolutely no power source. The heavy rubber fuel lines were visibly severed, dangling over the railing like dead, dry veins. The generator room below was an empty, echoing husk of concrete. Yet, the massive glass lens was rotating. It spun with a flawless, frictionless grace, completely silent, driven by a kinetic energy that defied every established law of physics. The brass fittings securing the glass were not just clean, they were immaculate, buffed to a pristine mirror shine. And in the dead center of the lens, hovering exactly where the bulb should have been mounted, floated a sphere of pulsating, cold, white luminescence. It was not a fire, and it was not electricity. It was dense and seemingly gelatinous, a condensed ball of daylight that seemed to actively swallow the light from their flashlights rather than reflect it. The team's communications officer frantically tried to radio their vessel anchored offshore. Only harsh, rhythmic static answered back from the speaker, pulsing in exact, terrifying synchronization with the silent rotation of the lens. On a small metal maintenance desk facing the ocean window, a heavy leather-bound logbook lay open. The pages were filled with neat, cursive handwriting, detailing the weather conditions and the routine maintenance of the glass. The entries were consecutive, never missing a single day over the past 4 decades. The final entry, written in fresh, glistening red ink, described their own arrival upon the rocks just 3 hours prior, detailing the exact names of the crew members and the frantic expressions on their faces. As the sun finally dipped below the churning gray horizon, the strange sphere of light in the center of the lens violently expanded. The silent rotation of the glass accelerated to a dizzying blur, and the beam erupted outward, a blinding, piercing column of spectral white that sliced through the gathering evening fog. But standing there in the blinding glare, the crew realized the beam wasn't aimed horizontally toward the perilous shoals. The great prism mechanically tilted, angling the massive beam of impossible light straight up into the dense, suffocating clouds, illuminating the heavy belly of the storm. It was not a warning to keep ships away from the rocks. It was a beacon. As a massive, unfathomable silhouette shifted in the clouds high above, temporarily blocking out the beam, the horrifying truth settled in the freezing lantern room: if the lighthouse had been summoning something from the sky every night for 40 years, what exactly had been answering the call? Complete.